It's not so many years ago that every major cinema in the land had a theatre organ and, of course, a resident organist to go with it. But unfortunately, through the years, this fell into a decline until, as far as I'm aware, there is not a single theatre anywhere now in the United Kingdom that has a regular resident organist on a daily basis. Well, now, this organ here is in fact the last surviving instrument in the whole of Ireland. That's the last playable surviving instrument. And it used to be in the Tonic Cinema in Bangor. It's over 50 years old, and in 1974 it was moved here in the assembly hall of the Grantshire Boys High School, also in Bangor. And I think for all its years it still plays exceedingly well.
Stanley Wyllie has had two very different careers. For more than 20 years, he was an accomplished cinema organist playing in some of the top cinemas in the British Isles.
Roll detail line.
In 1959, he started a new career as a transmission controller in Ulster Television. Retired now, Stanley is still in great demand as an organist and plays regular concerts here and in England.
Started really my interest in organs when my father took me around to the Guildhall in Portsmouth, where there was a magnificent organ, rather like the one in the Ulster Hall in Belfast, and there used to be regular concerts on Sunday afternoons there, and the city organist used to provide a wonderful mixture of various types of music. And apparently I was only about 3 to 4 years of age, and from what I was told in later years, I used to sit as good as gold alongside my father and listen to every note that was played. The family moved from the south of England up to the north of England, and we arrived in Yorkshire and in Leeds, and I went to school, had to change my schooling, and quite a traumatic experience really for the family, moving from the very south of England up to the north of England. And I'm talking now about the late 20s, very early 30s, and there was quite a difference between the two, and we had to acclimatise in many ways. I did go to school shortly after arriving in Leeds. I went across to Bradford, which was nearby, and I think this is where the real interest in the theatre organ started, because I was going to a high school at Bradford, and when I went through the centre of Bradford to get up to the high school, I had to pass this magnificent theatre, the New Victoria Cinema was called, in Bradford, which seated about 3,000 people, just over 3,000 people, and for those who can remember Ritz, Belfast, when it was just a one screen and not a four screen as it is now, we seated then in the Ritz about just over 2,000 people, so you can imagine that the New Victoria in Bradford was quite a large place. It had a magnificent organ, and not only the organ alone, but they had an orchestra on the stage, so when you went along you saw your film, you heard the organ, and you also were able to listen to a first-class orchestra playing. So I think you really got your money's worth. What I used to do when I came down from school sometimes, my mother used to give me sufficient money to take myself into the cinema, and I used to listen and wait for the organ to come up, and then I would sit on and watch the film round and the orchestra and wait till the organ came up again. So it was a bit later by the time I got home. Probably my homework suffered considerably in that period, which is probably why I was never exactly what one would call a brilliant scholar at school. My family moved yet again up to County Durham, which was the next county up. And it was there that when I left school, I started to have full-time study in music, and wanted, of course, to get straight onto a theatre organ. But no, my music teacher, who was a brilliant organist in Newcastle on Tyne, did insist he had me on the piano first for at least 3 years before he would take me on the organ. So we had a lot of catching up to do. Had to get up to Chopin waltzes and Beethoven sonatas and that sort of thing. And then he said, I'll teach you the organ as a separate instrument. I think in light of that, he was a very wise man, actually. At the time, I didn't think so. But whilst I was learning the piano and music generally, I was introduced to an organist who lived where we were living in County Durham, who did play in Newcastle on Tyne at one of the big cinemas, which was one of the chain of cinemas owned by Alfred Black. Alfred was the brother of George Black, great impresarios, theatres in London and so forth. And they had 4 cinemas in the northeast of England, one in Gateshead, one in Newcastle, one in South Shields, and one in Sunderland. Sunderland was the headquarters cinema, which again was another 3,000-seater. I went along one Saturday morning with this organist who played in Newcastle, and he started to give me a few tips on how to play and the type of music and so on. I didn't let my music teacher know, of course, that I was having lessons on the side of the theatre organ. Then he would have been very pleased. That's how it worked anyway, and he introduced me then to the musical director, who said, like to hear you play something, and I played a few things, and he must have liked it reasonably enough. Thank goodness, because we're back to the old problem here. Where do you find a theatre organ to practice on? You just don't pick them up and walk down the street and find them. And normally, of course, when you go into a theatre, or somebody, the manager would say, can you play the organ before I let you on it? And if you would say no, you probably don't get on it. So anyway, luckily I had the organ in Sunderland to practice any time I wanted. And from there on, I started to do relief work while the organists of the 4 cinemas were on holiday. Then I became assistant organist in Sunderland, and then later organist. By that time I was the wonderful old age of 18. And of course, in those days, the musical director brought the organ up in full view of the public with the spotlights, and he was the one that got all the applause. The organist actually, as against the musical director, the organist did the filling in, as we call it, on the organ, which was a very specialised thing in those days, and I was very grateful for it. You had to, on a Monday morning, have what you might call a band call with a projection box, because they played you over the trailers, the start of the newsreel, so you could make a note of what keys they were in. And what you did, your work as an organist, down, playing with the organ down in the pit, so it wasn't seen, was that you linked up all these various trailers and newsreels into the right key. Say you were coming out in E flat of your major film, you then modulated down perhaps into the key of C, and that was the start maybe of the trailer for next week. And at the end of that, you found out that the trailer finished in the key of A major, and you had to then modulate from A major to the start of the, whatever it may have been, the Paramount News, I think it was in those days, or the Pathy News, key of C, and you had to modulate down to that. Just as it hit the screen, you reached the key of C along with it. So you had to be pretty split-second timing. Great fun. But then I did get my chance to go up and in the full spotlight, and that was a wonderful experience. And I enjoyed my work in Sunderland very much indeed. I think then the family moved down, the start of the war, the last war, and the family moved down back to the south of England, and I was lucky then to join ABC, and that's where I started with ABC in Torquay. And, a very, very nice place to be, and a lovely organ. And the organist that had just left was one of the famous Reginalds. There were 4 famous Reginalds at the time, including Reg Dixon, of course. This one was Reginald Porter Brown, and he had been organist at the Regal Torquay, and the manager there had got him his first broadcast. He was a brilliant organist, and anyway, I mean, wherever he had been. But the organ was a superb instrument, and therefore the BBC loved it. And I think I was very lucky that when I followed, he went on to Southampton, and I followed him at Torquay, and I got my first broadcast just before I went into the RAF. We used to play out at officers' mess dances, sergeants' mess dances, the local town hall, and local village hops and all that. You were doing a bit of a PRO job as well, I think, with a band in those days, and you played for civilian workers on various sites on aircraft buildings, terminals and so forth. So we played all types of music too. So it was quite good fun. I went over to the continent about 6 or 7 weeks after D-Day. We landed in France. I never thought I'd be playing the organ for quite a while, but strange enough, within a year, we had arrived in Brussels, and we were very lucky enough to be stationed in Brussels for 8 months. And during that time, I did some broadcasts over the Belgian radio network. And they have a wonderful concert organ in the Broadcasting House in Brussels. I remember it was a thrill. I wonder if it's still there. It'd be wonderful. I had no music with me, of course. Didn't carry music in your kit back in those days, so you just relied on the memory. And luckily, that's one thing I always did have, a pretty good memory for music. Unlike one of the organists going back to the days of, in the northeast of England. I remember one of the organists that played in Gateshead. We had to, in those days, of course, play the national anthem. So we had to stay on to the very end of the film show at night. And he never could play the national anthem without having the music up on the music stand. This was something I always wondered at, actually, but there you are. I used to go up to BFN in Hamburg to do some organ broadcasts, and I was told, well, would you not rather come and join us permanently rather than keep on flying up and flying back? It was a bit of a nuisance. It took about an hour and a quarter, sometimes in atrocious conditions where I was very surprised we ever landed at all. And so I was grateful to the opportunity, once I got permission from the CO, to join British Forces Network in Hamburg. And I was appointed as staff organist there and did 3 organ broadcasts a week and some piano work. And we had one very famous name locally, it's known locally, who was on the staff at that time, and that was Roy Bradford. He was in a different department from the one I was in, and he used to do quite a lot on the radio side, both from announcing and various productions. And I never thought when someone said, oh yes, Roy comes from Northern Ireland actually, and I never thought that probably many years later on I would be coming to Northern Ireland myself. After the war, I came back to the Regal Torquay, where I had left when I joined up. And luckily the same manager was there who was there at the beginning. And he always said, well, if I'm still here, when and if you come back, which is, I thought, a nice way of putting it, and I did come back, thank goodness, he said, you'll be back here, and whoever is here will move, you see. So that was, I never knew whether to believe that or not, but he stuck by his word. As soon as I came back to Torquay, the organist that was there was moved to another cinema. So I stayed there in Torquay and had a very happy period up until the end of 1951, start of 1952, when Joseph Seal, who was always one of my boyhood heroes, if you like, on the organ, I used to listen to all Joseph Seal's broadcasts from the Ritz Belfast. And Joseph Seal became musical director for ABC, and as a result he had to leave Belfast and, of course, go over to headquarters in London. And he had to appoint a successor. And I suppose I was very, very lucky to be asked to be his successor. And when he said, would you like the job, of course, I couldn't get round the corner fast enough to say yes. It was among the probably most famous broadcasting organs on the circuit. It had such a fabulous ambience, I would say, in the theatre. The organ sounded so good. And of course it was a very fine instrument. 4 manuals, 10 ranks of stops with a monotone unit, which is an electronic unit that you can blend in with the pipes. And also a grand piano on the stage, which you could play from the organ console. So it was a very wonderful period actually to start, and had 8 very, very happy years at the Ritz with big shows, midnight matinees, where you had stage shows and personal appearances from the film stars that were in the film that particular night. And the ABC regarded the Ritz Belfast as the equivalent of a West End of London theatre. So it was a place to be really proud, actually, to be in. When I arrived at UTV, I was offered a position, as in those days it was still trainee assistant transmission controller, which was a far cry really from playing the organ. Although it was rather like sitting at an organ console where you have all the various buttons in front of you, and instead of selecting various stop registrations, like clarinets, trumpets, oboes, etc., and strings, you were selecting telecines and VTRs, and continuity announcers, station clock, network, VTR, so on and so on. The only thing that was missing was some foot pedals to go underneath, actually, which would have made me feel much more at home.
Roll VTR line.
UTV did a series of programs called From Glen to Glen, which luckily turned out to be very popular. And the organ was used, strangely enough, I thought, it was very strange to use a cinema organ in a program which is basically traditional music, traditional Irish music, of course. And I used the organ as an orchestral background, not as a sort of a Blackpool tower where it's her sound.
Once there lived a farmer, a good old soul was he. I used to work upon his farm down in the country. He had one only daughter, and her I chanced to win. And when I asked him for her hand, these words he did begin. Treat me, daughter, kindly, and shade her from all harm. Before I die, I will to you my little house and farm, my horse, my dog, my cow, and my bonny sheep and barn, and all the little chickens round the garden.
This particular flooding in the 70s, it was really a very, very bad flood situation. People all the way up the Grosvenor Road were in a very bad way indeed. I can remember seeing people's furniture out on the pavements and in a terrible mess. And of course, quite wisely, the fire brigade authorities for pumping water out were having to concentrate on people's homes rather than the cinema at that time. Cinema was all right on the whole, except of course for underneath the stage. I should explain that the organ chambers in the Ritz Cinema were underneath the stage, so therefore unfortunately they were in the very lowest part of the building, which was the first part obviously to get the floodwater. My predecessor Joseph Seal had problems in the 40s, I remember, when the organ flooded. But at this particular flooding in the 70s, the organ chambers suffered from 6 feet of water. And it was a filthy, dirty, black water. I think God alone knows what was in it all, but it was really terrible. It stayed like that for all of 6 or 7 days before they came round to pump it out. And of course it was virtually completely ruined. Joseph Seal came over and you might almost say pronounced the last rites over it. He was very disappointed. The organ that she had helped to build the 14 years that he had been resident there just suddenly overnight virtually had ceased to exist. Well, although the Ritz organ never did play again, unfortunately, I'm glad to say that the trumpet rank did survive, and here in the heart of the English countryside in Hertfordshire, it is installed in the Compton lounge of the Plough Inn. Well, that was the sound of the trumpet rang from the Ritz Belfast, now installed on this organ. And I would like to utilize it in a piece of music which reminds me of my very early days when I was at UTV, and it was a series called Thunderbirds.